Hi everyone. In this tutorial we're going to do a simple subdivision surface modeling exercise and create a bolt like the one you see in the viewport here. As always, there's a number of ways you can do an object like this, but it's always a good idea to first have a closer look at the object you want to model and analyze the shapes, because that will give you an idea as to how you can go about modeling something like this. Let's have a look at the top view here, and you can see that we have a circle shape at the center and we have a hexagon shape on the outside. Basically we can model this bolt either by starting with a circle, in which case you want to make sure that you pick a number of vertices or segments for the circle that is divisible by 6, because you want it to match up with the 6-sided hexagon. Or we could start this bolt by modeling the hexagon shape first. If you take a look at this orthographic view, which shows the sides of the hexagon, you can see that we have a curved top here. The first version of the bolt we're going to do is one that has a very low polygon count. However, because we need this curvature here, there's only so much we can do. And in order to get this curvature here, we need at least 2 faces or polygons. The next question is, how do we start modeling this shape? And again, there's a number of ways you can do that. You could start with a cylinder, for example. Personally, I prefer to start with flat or 2-dimensional geometry whenever possible, because it's so much easier to control the shape and add and modify geometry before you turn it into a 3-dimensional object. And that's what we're going to do in this particular case. I'll start a new file, and I'm not going to save this one. And we're going to start with a circle or a disc shape. So let's go ahead and go to Add, Mesh, and add a circle. You can also hit Shift and A and add a circle from the context menu here. And by default, this circle has way too many vertices. We can change a few things down here in the operator panel. Let's start with the vertex count and bring this down to 6. I'm not going to change the radius, which means we're going to model a ridiculously big bolt, but that's okay. This is just a modeling exercise, and also we can always scale the finished object down to the size that we need it to be. So I'm going to keep the radius as it is, but I want to create some geometry here, and we have a couple of options for the fill type. By default this is set to nothing. We can also create an n-gon or a triangle fan, which is what I'm going to do here. And I'll go to my overlays or viewport overlays and switch on wireframe so we can see the edges here. And there you go, that's our basic hexagon shape. Right now we don't have enough geometry because each of these sides only has 1 edge, and we need 2 to be able to create the curvature I was talking about earlier. So let's go to edit mode. And by default, all of the vertices are selected. We just need to hold down Control, left click and drag to deselect this vertex here. And then I'm going to subdivide the other vertices, and you can do that by going to the edge menu here. You can find subdivide up here. I use that a lot, so I have a custom shortcut for that. You could also right click in the viewport and pick the subdivide option from the context menu here. So let's go ahead and do that. And as you can see, this creates an additional vertex on each of the 6 sides. And now we can start creating the 3-dimensional object. So I'm going to switch to face mode here and select all the faces. And I'm going to use the Inset tool. The shortcut for that is I. And let's do maybe something like this. And then we can hit A to select everything. You can also go to the select menu here and select all. And the next tool we're going to use is the extrude tool. The shortcut for that is E. So let's hit E and just move the mouse up a little bit, and let's do something like this. You can see that here at the top we don't really have a circular shape yet. So let's go ahead and change that. I'm going to select these faces here. And then we need an add-on that comes with Blender, but which is not installed by default. And this add-on is called Loop Tools. If you go to Edit Preferences, and then go to your add-ons and look for Loop. it is the mesh loop tools. So just activate that, and once this is active, you can access it in edit mode either by right-clicking in the viewport, and you have the loop tools options up here. You can also use the end panel, and you can find the loop tools under the edit tab here. I'll just hit N to hide that panel again. So let's go ahead and right-click and go to loop tools, and we need the circle option here. And you can see this turns the selection into a circle. If I switch to my top view, everything looks fine. And we have some options here in the operator panel. We can switch the method, for example. The default is best fit. I'm going to switch that to fit inside. It's not really important though, because we could also just scale these faces if we wanted to. Next, let's go ahead and create the curvature on the outer walls here. And in order to do that, I'm going to switch to vertex mode. And we can either select a vertex here, then hold down Shift and left click to select the next vertex. We could also do a loop selection of the vertices on the outside here, and then use the checker deselect option. In order to do that, however, it's important that you hover over a specific vertex, and in this case I'm going to hover my mouse over one of the corner vertices. And then we can use the loop selection and then go to select and checker deselect, and as you can see, now we have all the vertices selected that we need. So let's go ahead and move these up a little bit, and let's do something like this. And with the 3 key you can switch back to face mode. Let's select these faces here and move them up. And you can probably see that we have this weird crease here. And the reason we have that is if you rotate your camera around, you can see we have a twisted polygon. And this is what you would call a non-planar polygon, and that means that the 4 vertices of this polygon do not lie in the same plane. And that is a bad thing. It will cause shading issues, texturing issues, and other problems. So this is something we want to avoid. Let's go back to face mode and grab these top faces here again. I'll just move these up a little bit more. That pretty much gets rid of part of the problem at least. But if you rotate the camera around, you can see the polygon is still non-planar. So let's try and improve this a little bit further. One thing we can't do is select the polygon and scale it to 0 along its normal. And the reason we can't do that is because it would also change the shape of the rest of the object. Now, in order to be able to scale this polygon, what we would need to do is go to this menu here, the transformation menu, and we need to hit the plus button with this face here selected. And this will create a new transform orientation. And now we could use the scale tool, scale this on the z-axis, hit 0 to scale it down to 0. But if I go to my top view here and hit Ctrl Z to go back a step, you can probably see the shape change slightly. If I redo that, you can probably see that. So that's the reason why we can't really scale this polygon, which means we need to eyeball things. Let's go ahead and grab these faces at the top again, and I'll just rotate my camera around. There's basically 2 things that we can do to fix this issue here. We can either scale the faces at the top, or we can move the vertices at the center of each of the sides down a little bit. Or maybe we'll need to do a mixture of both. In any case, let's rotate the camera around a bit, something like this, and hit S for scale. And then I'm just going to scale these top faces until I have 2 edges here that are more or less parallel. So I think that's almost perfect. We don't need to move the vertices here at the center of these sides. So that's good, but actually I want to move these top faces here up a little bit further, which probably means we need to go in and correct the shape again a little bit by scaling these faces down at the top until we have parallel edges here. Okay, so that looks good. Now let's go ahead and create an inset here at the top. And for this I'm going to use I for the inset tool, and let's do an inset like this, and then hit E for extrude and extrude these faces down a little bit. And you can see here at the top we have four-sided polygons, which is basically good. But then again, we also have a complex pole here. And a complex pole is a vertex that is connected to either less than 4 edges or, in this case, more than 4 edges. Arguably, you can get away with this in this particular case because it's a flat surface. So even when we apply a subdivision surface modifier, things should be okay. But I want to do this properly, so I'm going to change the topology up here. Let's go back to face mode, grab all of these faces, hit X, and then delete these faces here. Next, we need to go to edge mode and loop select the edges here. And we're going to use a command or tool called the fill tool, and you can access that by going to, I think it's under edge or face, under face. So fill and grid fill. We have these two options here. You could also right click in the viewport and choose fill from the context menu here. But fill is not very useful in this particular case, and I'm going to hit Ctrl F, which is the shortcut that will give us access to both fill and grid fill. In this case, I'm going to use grid fill. If I switch to my top view, you can see that we have pretty nice and even geometry. However, in this particular case, I want to do this even a little more low poly. And if you take a look at the operator panel, again, we have some options here. We could change the span, for example, and reduce the polygon count. I don't want to go as low as 1 though. Let's do a span of 2 and create something like this. And I'm also going to change the offset and rotate it around to match it up with the orientation of the polygons or the flow of the polygons on the rest of this object here. Now here at the bottom, we don't really need the polygons or faces at the center. This bolt will sit on top of a surface of another object and we'll never see the bottom of it. So we might as well get rid of these faces here. So let's switch to face mode, and I'm going to select these faces here, hit X and delete the faces. We're going to keep the polygon ring around the edge because we'll need that in order to be able to create the control edges. And that's pretty much it for the modeling part of this bolt. So as you can see, we have a minimum of 2 polygons that we need to create this curvature here, and whatever number of polygons we choose for these sidewalls here will determine the overall polygon count of the object. And 2 is as low as we can go. If you take a look at the statistics, it still means that we have 68 faces on this object here, and that is not counting the control edges that we're going to create in a second. Let's go back to object mode and create the control edges next. In this case, we can stay non-destructive and use a bevel modifier to create those edges. In many cases, you will have to apply the bevel modifier afterwards and then go back into edit mode and fix the geometry where necessary. But in this case, we should be fine and we won't need to apply the bevel modifier. So let's go ahead and go to the modifier properties here and let's add a bevel modifier. And by default, this doesn't look too good. That's because the amount is way too high. Let's bring this down to maybe 3. Let's also change the segments to 2. And because we're going to stay non-destructive, we could actually keep it like that. However, in subdivision surface modeling, you don't really want the control edges to change the shape or the original shape of the object. And in this case, the bevel modifier adds this curvature here. Like I said, we could get away with it because we're not going to have to apply the bevel modifier, but let's change it anyway. We can do that under the profile options here. You can see we have a shape option, and by default this is set to 0.5. All we need to do is crank this up to 1, and we're getting proper control edges. Now you can see I also have a beveled edge up here, which is not good because when we subdivide this area will not really look round. And maybe you also have an issue here with control edges that are missing. Now in my case I don't have that. The reason we're getting these problems with the edges here is the angle that is set to 30 degrees by default in the bevel modifier, and all we need to do is increase that angle a little bit, and you can see the bevel disappears here. If you also have the problem of missing control edges in this area here, that would mean that the angle of the bevel modifier is too high. But the problem, of course, is that we can't go lower than 30 degrees because the bevel modifier will also start to bevel these edges up here. If you do encounter that problem, what you can do to fix it is tab back into edit mode and loop select the polygons here at the top, not these ones, but these ones, and just move them up or down a little bit until the bevel modifier catches this edge. Which basically means you need to move them up or down until the angle between these edges changes to something that is recognized by the angle setting here. Okay, but in this case I don't have that problem, so I don't need to change anything else. Next we're going to apply a subdivision surface modifier to smooth everything out. And I need to scroll down a little bit to find that. And there we go. If I switch off my wireframes here in the overlays, you can see the object has been smoothed, but it doesn't really look smooth, and that's because we need to do something else here. With the object selected, right click and select shade smooth, and now that looks a lot better. Now usually in hard surface modeling you will also in many cases need to go to the object data properties and go to normals and check auto smooth. In this case we don't need to do that, everything looks fine, but we could if we wanted to. But as you can see, if I switch that on, we're getting these sharp edges again, and that's because the auto smooth angle is way too low. So we would need to crank this up, and you can see these edges here are looking much rounder already. We still have sharp corners here, so we need to bring this angle up a little bit further. And something around 60 degrees I think should do the trick. So there you go. Now everything's looking just like it did before we switched that on and before we changed the angle from 30 degrees to about 60. But like I said, in this case we don't really need the auto smooth option. And we might as well leave it unchecked. The object still looks a bit faceted, but that's quite normal. If you go to your modifier properties, you can see that the levels for the viewport are set to 1, which makes sense in order to keep, you know, the polygon count in the viewport low, and it's just faster for Blender to calculate the mesh with the levels set to something like 1 in the viewport. For the render, this is set to 2. We can also change it for the viewport to smooth out the geometry. But if you have a lot of objects in your scene, you know, it's probably best to keep this at 1. And you may also notice that I have these weird shading lines here. You probably won't have those. That's just because my viewport shading, in my viewport shading options, I have switched on cavity. I like to use that for modeling. It creates some shadows and fake ambient occlusion. If I switch that off, you can see all of that shading is gone. Let me just switch the wireframe back on. So that's our first bolt. We're going to do one more that has slightly more resolution, and we will start again with the hexagon shape. So let's move that over to here, and maybe let's also name it. You can use the F2 key, I think. I have changed that to F5 if I have the object selected and hit that F5 key. This window will pop up and I'll rename this to bolt LP for low poly. So let's start a new bolt with a slightly higher resolution, and again we're going to start with a circle, so let's go ahead and add one to the scene. Blender will remember the settings from before and we can keep everything as it is. So let's tab right away into edit mode and go to vertex mode. In this case I want to create 3 edges per side. Let's go ahead and deselect the vertex at the center, and I'm going to use subdivide twice. which will create 4 edges. And actually, before I do that, I'll grab these 2 vertices here, hit X and delete the vertices. And then let's hit A to select everything, deselect this vertex here and subdivide twice. And if you want to, you can keep a copy of this object and maybe create another even more high poly version of the bolt. But for this example, we're going to do 3 edges per side. So I'm going to randomly select 1 vertex on each of these sides, hit X. And this time we can't just delete the vertices because we would create something like this. So let's undo that. And what I'm going to do instead is hit X and dissolve these vertices. And if I go to my top view here, you can see we have the 3 edges that we want, but they're not spaced apart evenly. Let's go ahead and select everything, deselect this vertex here, and let's use the loop tools one more time. And this time we need the space option. So if I use that with all of these sides selected, you can see the edges get spaced apart more evenly, but we're also getting dents in the mesh here, which is not what I want. So let's go ahead and undo that. And the simple fix for that is to just deselect the vertices on one side. So you don't want to have these connected sides all selected, and then just run the space command again. This is one of those tools or commands that I use so often that I have a shortcut assigned to it. And then we can select these verts here and run that command again. And now we have evenly spaced geometry on all 3 sides. Let's tab back into object mode, go to the modifier properties, and let's add a mirror modifier. Depending on how you did this object, you may need to change the axis. In my case, everything's fine. I'm going to apply the mirror modifier and tab back into edit mode, go to face mode, select all the faces and inset them like so. And this time I'm going to right click and use loop tools and circles right away. Unlike before, you can see we're getting a circle, but it's kind of, not rotated the way, or rotated in a way that it lines up with the world grid. And I want to change that. And there's 2 ways we can rotate this around. First of all, let's hit the Z key, and I'm going to switch to wireframe here so I can see things a little bit better, and we can zoom in to this area here maybe. We still have our options in the operator panel, and there's no need to change anything. Blender still remembers that we used fit inside the last time. I'm going to keep it like that. And we can change the angle though and rotate these polygons around. If I hold down Shift, I can rotate in smaller increments, and we can get pretty close to that center line here. It doesn't need to be perfect. Another way would be to just hit R for rotate and rotate these faces around. And if you do that in the top view, you don't need to worry about constraining rotation to an axis. It will automatically be constrained to your top view. Let's hit the Z key again, go back to solid mode, and let's extrude these polygons. I'm going to select everything and hit E for extrude and extrude these up a little bit. And then switch to edge mode and grab all of the edges at the center. This time we can't use check deselect, or at least it would be slower to do that. But I think we can't really use check deselect because it deselects every other edge, and right now we have 2 edges in between the selected edges, so it's probably not going to work. I haven't tried it though. Let's grab the faces at the center. Like before, we have the issue with that non-planar polygon here. We need to fix that like before. So let's move these faces up a little bit, do something like this. And I think I also want to scale these down a little bit more and do maybe something like this. And let's rotate the camera around, and let's see if we can fix this non-planar polygon by scaling the top faces. And yes, I think that looks good. So just by rotating or scaling these a little bit, we can get rid of this issue here. Okay, good enough, I think. We could also just grab the edges here at the center and move them down a little bit. And again, before I do, I'll just rotate my camera around a little bit, something like this, and then I'm going to move these edges down like so, and there we go. That's that issue fixed. Next, I'm going to select the faces at the top again and use the Inset Faces tool, and then extrude to extrude these faces down. We also need to fix the topology here at the top. This time we have both a complex pole at the center here, and we also have n-gons, which is something I try to avoid in subdivision surface modeling, although in this case you could get away with them because it's a flat surface. But let's do this properly. So I'm going to hit X and delete these faces, and then I'm going to loop select these edges here and Control F, and let's do a grid fill, switch to the top view. In this case, I'm not going to change the span. You could if you wanted to and reduce the polygon count a little bit, but I don't really like the distribution of the geometry up here. So I'll do something like this and then just use the offset option to rotate the geometry around a bit like this. Here at the bottom we can again delete the polygons at the center. So let's go ahead and do that. This time though, I'm going to do it slightly differently. You could just delete those and keep that circular hole at the bottom if you wanted to, but I want to create a polygon strip around the edges like I did with the previous bolt. So I'm going to hold down Control and hit plus on the numpad, and then we can use the F key to fill the area and create a single n-gon here. And now we can use the Inset tool, I, and do something like this, and then just hit X and delete this face at the bottom here. So the modeling part for this bolt is done. Let's jump back into object mode and add a bevel modifier. We need to make the same changes basically as before. So I'm going to change the amount to 3, the segments to 2, and the profile to 1. And in my case, it seems that I don't have any issues with additional edges being beveled or missing control edges, so everything looks fine here. I'll add a subdivision surface modifier right away. And then I'm going to right click and use Shade Smooth, and there we go. That's our finished object. I'll grab both of these, so maybe I'll move this one over a little bit here. Go to my top view, select both of them and move them to the center. Let's do something like this. And that's the end of this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll record another video and I'm going to show you in that video how you can do a nice wireframe render and show off the topology that we've just created. Thanks for watching everyone. Take care and I'll see you again soon.